Hello everybody, welcome back to the Juneau-Douglas City Museum's new video series. I'm Niko, I'm the curator here, but our artist behind the camera is Alyssa, and we are down here in the basement channeling, my goodness, I cannot say that word, channeling our inner Mr. Rogers here with our research and reference collection behind us. We're actually in what I consider to be my office, so we're outside the collection storage area but still in kind of the collection's workspace. So today we're going to be talking about a very famous Alaskan painter, and looking at the piece beside me, it's not fair because Alyssa already knows, but for those of you watching who got the preview, does everyone know who we're going to talk about? We're going to be talking about Sidney Mortimer Laurence. So Sidney Laurence is a very interesting person and an interesting painter, and up until recently not a lot was known about kind of his past and his biographical history. Really all we had were this huge collection of art pieces from him. He was a prolific painter. They estimate close to 5,000 pieces he created, especially while here in Alaska, which if you're not a painter yourself, that's a lot of pieces, that's a lot of work. So he was actually not originally Alaskan. He was born in New York in 1865, and he studied at the New Student School there, and he married Alexandrina Dupree in 1889, and the two of them almost immediately crossed the Atlantic to settle in St. Ives in Cornwall, which was an artist community. And he did live there for about 10 years. He showed pieces throughout Europe and was, if not well known, his name was out there and people knew who he was, but St. Ives was also a huge artist community. There was a lot of competition, and after about 10 years and starting a family, for still to this day sort of unknown reasons, he packed up and moved to Alaska in 1903, 1904. It looks as though he did leave his family in Cornwall, in England, and as far as I've been able to find in kind of quick research, I won't pretend to be a Sidney Laurence super fan or an extreme person of knowledge on him, but it doesn't look like his family followed, and we don't know if the intention was for them to follow after him or if it really was him just escaping to what he might have considered the freedom of Alaska. He originally moved not necessarily for art, but to try his hand at prospecting. When he didn't find gold and strike it rich, he kind of fell back on what he knew, and he started a photography business in Valdez and then continued that practice when he moved to Anchorage. And he did run that for a few years, but started to paint again, and his paintings started to sell. And once he was able to establish himself as a painter and was able to sell his pieces, he closed his photography studio to focus on art full time. He did paint in Alaska up until his death in 1940. By that time, he was commuting back and forth between Alaska and California, like a lot of people do when they get a little bit older in Alaska. Winters can be difficult here, so he would spend a lot of his summertime up here painting in the beautiful landscapes, but then spending the winter months in LA in the warmer Southern California climate. He's a very unique painter for that time period. He really pioneered that idea of the last frontier, especially for outsiders of Alaska looking at what does Alaska mean. And that feeling really continues to today. It was kind of an extension of the manifest destiny, that idea that people of European descent had this God-given right and desire to conquer and move across the North American continent. And by the time Sidney Laurence came around, most of the American West had already been settled. So what was left? Alaska. And it's an interesting commentary really, because the scenes that he portrays and the feeling that he inspires in most people who are viewing his work is very much this unspoiled landscape, seeing these places for the first time that no one has ever seen before. Of course, that's in direct contradiction to the fact that there were many people living here in Alaska before people of European descent arrived here. So there's always going to be a little bit of that conflict of the impression that the paintings give and the nostalgia that they create with kind of the reality of the time period. So even though he's often considered one of Alaska's greatest painters, he wasn't originally Alaskan, and really he sinks home for most people who are from outside Alaska. The other interesting thing about Sidney Laurence is that he is mostly famous here in Alaska. So I bet those of you who are watching from other places around the country or around the world might not have recognized his style or his art. Though his paintings are in collections and galleries around the world, he's really most famous here and most beloved here. And that's really what reflects back when people come to visit Alaska. So I promise not to get too technical, but whenever you're talking about art, you generally start talking about art schools and the method that they used and things of that nature. And when he was studying, really the two big landscape schools were the Hudson River School and French Impressionism. Now, those are incredibly contradicting styles. Hudson River is very much focused on clear, concise, very realistic impressions, or impressions might not be the right word, but depictions of landscape. French Impressionism is much more the impression of a place, more feeling-driven and less focused on minute details, unlike the Hudson River School. By the time Sidney Laurence is coming through school, developing his own personal style, the Hudson River School had kind of fallen out of favor with a lot of students. With the advent of photography, the idea was that paintings didn't necessarily need to have that realism anymore. And what Sidney Laurence ended up sort of painting in would be what we kind of refer to as tonalism. Tonalism isn't a strict school or style, it's more of an impression that's given when you're painting. So it has less to do with specific ideas and more to do with the feeling that comes out of that painting. So tonalists love morning, evening, mist, fog, things that are very atmospheric. For those of you in town today, this morning, especially downtown, was perfect for a painter like Sidney Laurence. Very low-hanging clouds, very misty, the light was coming through very blue and gray. So when you see these paintings, there's generally going to be an overall color scheme, an idea of the feeling that it conveys, and more of a mood than necessarily detailed description of the place itself. So here right next to me we have Early Morning, Juneau, Alaska. And for those of you in town, you'll recognize that scene. It's very, very popular, looking across the channel from Douglas at downtown Juneau with the steamship in there. And you'll notice the landscape is just solid enough to convey the place and give it some definition and really define it, but not so much that you're clearly looking at defined pieces of the mountain or the buildings themselves. So Sidney Laurence, quite often when he was painting, he didn't focus so much on figures. Figures, and in this case the ship kind of represents a figure, they weren't the most important part of the painting. They were interacting with it in a certain way, but really it was more to do with the landscape that the figures were in part of. So here we've got really the mountains, the light. It's almost always a treatment of the light. The light has its own personality, its own statement, more so than almost anything else in that painting. So over here, when talking about the tone of the painting, it's very blue, very pink and purple up above, but definitely has that tone of early morning. If you didn't know the name was Early Morning, generally for those of us who live here, that's when these mountains are going to be lit up. Because of the topography of our area, the sun has to go up a certain way, crosses the mountains, and then as it moves across, the light very noticeably and visibly moves around town. Some other places that are a little bit more flat, you really just have daytime and nighttime. Here in Juneau, we really do have the sun and light has its own personality, and you can track its movement through town almost like your daily commute. So we're going to switch actually over from Early Morning to our extra painting over here, surprise, Sidney Laurence. So this is Supper on the Mendenhall Bar. And as you can see, again, there's going to be an overall tone here, an overall color scheme, but it's very different than Early Morning Juneau. Whereas Early Morning in Juneau was much more blues, grays, purples, you're going to have more here, yellows, greens, browns, that really feel more of this is dinner time, and you do have that figure that's interacting with the painting, but they're really not the subject. What's the subject is that area and that feeling of being there. And again, you're going to see the trees are very obvious what they are. You're getting more than just the impression, but they're not so detailed as to really detract from the overall feeling. And that's kind of the big thing for Sidney Laurence paintings, in my opinion, and I don't pretend to be an expert at art, but very much, how does that painting make you feel? And for most people, it's that feeling of being in Alaska on this last frontier, looking at places that maybe nobody has seen before or hasn't seen in a long time or has never recorded, which I think is something that really follows through to today with all of the Instagram posts, and what we're all looking for, especially my generation and younger, is that pristine landscape, viewing something and sharing with other people this view of perfection. And that's kind of what Sidney Laurence was doing decades before we came along with cameras and phones and sharing on social media, was this pristine wilderness, this last frontier, which I think people still look for in Alaska today, which is why he continues to resonate with so many people and continues to be popular. So thank you very much for watching us today. Thank you for bearing with me through talking about super specific art things. Just wanted to mention that the other day you saw something that's an object in our collection, but we do also have artwork in our collection, and you're going to see another video talking about another aspect of our collection coming to you soon. So just a reminder that museums really hold, I think, more than people think about, and it's always fun exploring, at least for me. So thank you guys for tuning in with us, and we will see you soon.